Hello and welcome to Menalesh Meti. This is Metasebia Ketsela. I have a guest today, Professor Beniam Awash. I've had before. Today we'll be discussing about internal conflicts and Ethiopian relationship with the West and the East, especially with Trump and administration and Russia and China, all the rest of it. Stay with us. Professor Beniam, thank you very much and welcome back again.
Pleasure to be with you again. Good to see you.
Yes, it's been a while. Last time we discussed broadly about the East African region and the politics and the East and West interest in that region and area. It was very interesting because lots of people actually been asking for you. And I finally find you today. Thank you so much. And there has been a lot going on since we last discussed. We were discussing about the ports and the Ethiopian government, Abiy Ahmed attempted to have a relationship with Somaliland, that fell through, and then started another one with Somalia, and then that also is creating lots of problems. Now the government is also trying to return Assab port, and that people have lots of mixed feelings about it, and it's obvious that Ethiopia needs that access, the sea access, but then people are worried to having another war with Eritrea would be another chaos and lots of other issues. But perhaps we can start off Abiy Ahmed trying to negotiate with Trump. Hasn't been getting lots of attention to Trump, although Abiy Ahmed started a relationship with Russia, China, Emirates, and then now America, but it hasn't been getting enough attention from Trump. So last time there has been some issues. The Billy Graham Evangelical Association president, Reverend Franklin Graham, has been invited to Ethiopia. There has been an event, and has been a really very warm welcome about it, and he was very happy to be in Ethiopia. And then towards the end of his journey, he was clearly asked, will he be talking to Trump on our behalf? And he said, I'll make sure Trump knows about all of this, and it's all a message to Trump. And we know that he was very close to Trump administration and to the party and to himself. So do you think Abiy Ahmed is trying to have a relationship with America through church, or is there anything else that you might think of Trump and Ethiopia?
So maybe just starting off with the attempt to have a new relationship actually with Trump from the Abiy Ahmed administration in Ethiopia. You should think of him maybe in similar leaders of countries, such as the leader of Argentina, who is, in terms of his politics, more right-wing, tends to be conservative, and has really embraced more neoliberal approaches to economic reorganization. So that means a very similar situation that Ethiopia finds itself in, which is basically being accepting IMF dictates in terms of loans, having the debt that Ethiopia owes being used as restructuring its economy. And so you can see, very interestingly, Argentina and Ethiopia in a very similar light, where you have a very relatively populist come to power, is able to forge relationships with the United States. And you could see the president of Argentina, along with Elon Musk, for instance, on stage, going to Donald Trump's private home in Florida, right? So I think Abiy Ahmed's strategy, particularly since during the Trump first administration, there was a significant amount of support in terms of bringing Abiy to power. I don't think people understand how significant it was. So for instance, the longstanding U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, Donald Yamamoto, was very important in working behind the scenes, actually, in trying to convince the Eritrean leadership to begin dialogue, for instance, with the administration of Abiy Ahmed, in order to actually have that historic sort of peace agreement in which Ethiopia accepts the arbitration decision that was basically unimplemented up to that point. So you have the U.S. playing a very important role. You have the Assistant Secretary of State at that time, who was in, for instance, several times to Addis, very supportive of Abiy Ahmed's administration. You had the IMF that was also, again, very supportive, looking at Ethiopia's debt situation, trying to give them some support in return to privatization. You also had the Secretary of State at that time, which was Mike Pompeo, who visited Ethiopia, and again so you have all these, and what turned somewhat sour was the Biden administration and the Democrats, who really were hammering Abiy Ahmed in terms of human rights violations, kicking Ethiopia out of the free trade agreement, the trade agreement, the AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, which really significantly impacted a portion of Ethiopia's manufacturing industry. So the attempt now to kind of send an olive branch is very understandable. There's also, public commentary where Abiy Ahmed actually had mentioned how Trump was a very destabilizing figure, was an embarrassment to the United States, etc., because there was no expectation that actually Trump would win again.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a little bit of damage control, and in a sense having to do that. So asking for the evangelical lobby to help facilitate a better relationship makes sense. And it makes sense on, I think, on a very pragmatic level, but on a secondary level, when we look at the Ethiopia today, right? So the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, who themselves were never completely socialist, but nevertheless developed what's called a developmental state. And they had a particular ideology. They were secular in nature. There was a very clear distinction between state and religion. What you had since 2018 was a creation of a coalition. And what's very unique in the Abiy Ahmed administration is that coalition consists of a significant amount of a religious bloc, a religious base. And so the Muslim community in Ethiopia also, to a certain extent, was part of this base, certainly the Orthodox community, but a lion's share, a very important base, is the Protestant, or the Pente, what's called Pente in Ethiopia base. So it's very important just to give a sense here in terms of our discussion. I think Protestantism in Ethiopia is a very interesting phenomenon. Today, maybe about 18% of the population are what's called Pente. That means maybe about 13 million Ethiopians would be in that denomination in terms of faith. And the growth of Pentecostals as a religion in Ethiopia is one that is very interesting, right? It actually is giving a prominent role to women, unlike, let's say, traditional religions, for instance, that are there. It also subscribes to reaching out to some of the most impoverished members of the community, let's say widows, single mothers, abandoned women, etc. And it has a specific type of sort of mission as well. I want you to think here, when you look, so, in terms of self-help and organization, right? So for instance, it helps individuals with alcoholism and alcohol dependency, keeps children away as much as possible from the streets. So it does actually a significant amount of social work and social help. And as a religion, as a faith, it competes with the established religions in Ethiopia, Tewahedo Orthodox, as well as Islam, for, let's say, adherence. So it's a competition for souls. And since 1991, it's had a thawing because the previous government in Ethiopia was had a very ambivalent relationship to religion. So since 1991, you've had this explosion in terms of its growth in a religious movement sense. But it's only during Abiy Ahmed's time in 2018 that you have the instrumentalization, right? The kind of the blurring between church and state, and the use of religion in several ways. One is to create a coalition, a base, in which, for instance, the prime minister is seen as some sort of this prophetic figure, and those that are part of the Protestant community in Ethiopia are expected to toe the line and support the prime minister. And this has created a rift within the Protestant community as well, because this is a faith community, not a political organization. Okay. The second thing in which I think Protestantism is playing a very, very important political role in Ethiopia is the selection of individuals and the placing of them in various sectors of the state, right? In terms of their religion, right? So it's almost like if we reverse it from looking at the ethnic composition of bureaucracies and looking then at the sort of religious composition, so to speak. A third element I think which is interesting is that, many people say, what is the ideology of Ethiopia? What exactly is it that is motivating the government to act in its political sense and its economic sense? And this is essentially coming from the prosperity gospel. Again, comes from this religious sort of perspective about economics as well as politics. And I think in that sense, he's not faking it, right? This is a legitimate kind of almost a religious type of influence government. And so asking for the evangelical movement within the United States, which has a relationship with the government, but does not, occupy the same position as in Ethiopia, I think is a smart move on his part. And so you can see how that plays. But
will it work? Because the government, especially Trump, whether you are related to him or anything, will he be, accepting Ethiopia or Abiy Ahmed just because of the religion or because of the church? Because Ethiopia isn't just evangelical. There's a huge number of Orthodox Christian and Muslim. The government coming out being religious government and then providing and organizing this event on, like you said, whatever that percentage you mentioned, and then quoting the picture with the trying to tell Trump the whole country is this, and we're running with these principles and guidance. Would that get him anywhere? And is it also right as a government to come out as a religious government because you're running a country? There is lots of other religion in the country.
Yes. So as a government, it's actually playing with fire. I think Emperor Haile Selassie actually had a phrase where he said, religion is private and politics. What was it?
ሃይማኖት የግል አገር የጋራ.
So ሃይማኖት የግል አገር የጋራ, right? So religion is your private affair. The country, meaning public issues and politics, is a public affair. And I think that's a very wise adage, and there's a reason for that, right? So this is very important for just broadly how Ethiopian politics actually should be conducted in a very healthy manner, right? And also, it's also very good for the health of any spiritual community. This is a spiritual community, a religious community, not a political community. So it actually yibarrizual, right? Which is it mixes it. It actually takes its purity away, etc. So there's that element, which I think is
it brings about some sort of conflict as well. So
there's no question about that.
Taking side. Well,
yes.
The government, I don't think the government's religious, but just pretending to be religious. Because if he was religious, he wouldn't be killing all these people and doing all these nasty things to the community. But then the government decided to hide into one of the religion so that that religion is in conflict with the others.
That's correct. So, just like George Bush and Donald Trump, I think it is the evangelical, for instance, movement in the United States, which said that George Bush Jr., as well as Donald Trump, they're good for religion, but they're not religious. They're not believers, right? And so in the context of Ethiopia, for instance, the Protestant religious community has had an incredible opportunity, a very enabling opportunity, both in terms of economic opportunity, in terms of support from the state. So in that sense, it's good for religion, but the administration and the individuals are not religious figures. They're politicians, and they act in that fashion. And that's why it's very dangerous to mix religion and politics, as you say. In terms of whether it would work, so the United States operates on relatively stable interests. It's not very hard to kind of decipher it. When the Prime Minister Menalesh, when he came to power, and this is the 1990s, early 1990s, 1991, 1992. The intermediary was not a evangelical pastor, but he was a longtime CIA operative and a scholar named Paul Hines. He actually was the intermediary to try to convince Washington that the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which subscribes to a version of Marxism called Albanian Marxism, which aside from Albanians, I don't know who else knows about it, right? So it's really a fringe sort of ideology, but nevertheless, it was a mediation that tried to assuage Washington's perspective and let them know that these are pragmatic sort of forces. They're not socialist or Marxist, and that we can work with them. And he did that, I think, very effectively. So this process of let's say mediation is very important. And I think in this context, it gives us a sense of how far Ethiopia has come, to the extent that you have a prime minister of the country that is actually seeking a sort of a religious movement, and to a certain extent, a conservative political religious movement as a mediator with respect to Ethiopian and US relations. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, when we look at the long-term sort of interests of the United States, it revolves around, right now, the US is in the process of retreat. Okay, so 1991 is the process of almost a end of history euphoria, where there was a sense in the West, and certainly in the United States, the idea that the Soviet Union had collapsed, the ideology and the model of the United States had become victorious, and in terms of power, that the US was one, not amongst equals about others, but above everyone else, right? And so it lasted for about 10 years, but it was a very unique historic moment. The moment that we're in today is very different. This is a moment where you have multipolarity. You can think of it as nodes, centers of power that are very dispersed. And the United States is trying to find its place in this world. And part of the strategy with respect to the Trump administration is actually retreating from the world and reorganizing both the state and its relationship to the world. So that's why you see some dramatic actions that are being taking place. So for instance, the idea that the US should somehow de-linked from NATO, and Europe kind of stand on its own feet and fund itself. The retraction to the Western Hemisphere and attacking, neighbors such as Canada, Mexico, the attempt essentially to control successfully the Panama Canal from Panama. So all these are a way of rejigging, reorganizing U.S. power for what purpose? For the most important competition, which is against China, right? And so the road to China was through Russia. And unfortunately, the Russian campaign, which was using the Ukraine as a proxy, has ended in absolute and abject failure. And so here you have, one is a question of containing Russia, but perhaps in the long term. But since time is ticking, the issue is about China. So when you look from that perspective, Ethiopia's sort of outreach via Abiy Ahmed in terms of building a relationship then has to confront these long-term, very important interests that the United States have. Also, I would say in the context of Ethiopia, the regional dimensions is very important, meaning the Northeast Africa, what's called Middle East, dimensions of U.S. interest is very important. So, for instance, right now,
that interest is still there, because with the Democrats, they're always interested in these areas, and they have U.S. bases everywhere. And with Trump, is it really the same? Does Trump really care this much?
So it's not so much Trump, because in terms of policy, it's already it's much more crafted by a permanent, let's say, foreign policy establishment. Many American presidents can put their mark on it, but it's not necessarily an American president comes in and devise, let's say, a completely diametrically opposed strategy. So the question really here was between a segment of the American political elite that wanted to perhaps go forward with this drive to become the dominant power, and another segment that looked at trying to reposition themselves simply because of the huge, incredible, both economic and political transformations and military transformations. So Russia, for instance, as the preeminent military power, economically China as the preeminent military power, then the development of multilateral organizations and institutions, particularly BRICS, which is creating a new, let's say, architecture of economic trade. So it's really in that context, and then you have Trump representing a certain segment that has now propelled themselves to power, and they're trying to address this fundamental issue that's posed to the United States. And so in the Ethiopian context, regionally, Egypt is very critical because the Trump administration, so what have they done so far with respect to, say, Africa? Well, they started off with bombing Somalia. They've been bombing Somalia, the United States, in one administration after another consistently. So I think we should also be cognizant that, yes, there can be different groups, religious zealots, for instance, in Somalia, Al-Shabaab as an example, but don't forget they're Somalian. And the whole issue of, let's say, the Oromo Liberation Army, which is in Oromia, the Fano fighters in Amara region, these are all Ethiopians. And so the key issue for political conflict is to find a solution through dialogue and not continuous bloodshed and continuous destruction. So I think that's a very important element, and we should not be complacent in thinking that bombing Somalia in the name of going after Al-Shabaab is somehow okay. Right, so that's the first element. If you look at another impact in terms of Africa is the attack on South Africa. So South Africa is attacked because of its leadership role diplomatically in bringing Israel to the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, to adjudicate on the possible at this point, it really is, unfortunately, a genocide in Gaza, right? And so they've been targeted for that. Elon Musk has been very outspoken. He is a South African of the kind of apartheid clique, we could say, who migrated to the United States. And so they've been attacking South Africa as well for any attempt to have a democratic land reform movement in South Africa that redresses some of the colonial and apartheid era disenfranchisement of segments of the African population that's there, right? So that again is a very reactionary policy vis-a-vis Africa, because in South Africa, land reform is a huge issue. In Zimbabwe, which has been sanctioned to death up to today, the big sin of ZANU-PF government in Zimbabwe was land reform, right?
Yes.
Was land reform. So again, think of democracy as not something simply superficial in terms of having 2 or 3 parties that represent some constituency, going through the formality of elections, and essentially that's it. Substantive democracy is what we're talking about. So if you look at some of these countries, right, even under ZANU-PF, a single party state for the most part, one of the most democratic actions is to actually have land reform. Same thing with respect to South Africa. So think of these as anti-democratic policies that are being pursued already by the Trump administration. That's for South Africa. Lastly, I want to point out to you a very unfortunate issue. So if rare earth and critical minerals are in the front pages vis-a-vis, let's say, Ukraine or other areas that should be swallowed up, let's say, by Trump, right? Greenland, here I come. I think what's interesting is that you have a significant amount of rare earth, let's say coltan as an example, in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Rwanda, as a state, the RPF, Rwandan Patriotic Front, who came to power, same time, EPLF, TPLF, RPF, came to power and have 3 states. Each one becomes a government, EPLF in Eritrea, TPLF in Ethiopia, and the RPF in Rwanda. And one of the things that the RPF, their function, right, their essentially a vassal state. They have a very good relationship with the United States, actually.
Yes.
One of their function essentially is to control the flow of minerals and resources and exploitation of mineral resources in the Congo, particularly in favor of Western corporations, right? This results in massive amounts of violence. It results in massive amounts of exploitation of Congolese, death of Congolese. And all of a sudden you find Rwanda as one of the largest exporters of minerals it doesn't even have, right? So just recently you had the M23 essentially army that is trained, funded, supported by Rwanda, that is essentially in control of Eastern Congo, and not a word, by the way.
Exactly.
Yes, right. So again, this goes with this issue, and I would say, since we are on what are the impacts in terms of policy so far, there's quite a bit, but one of them, for instance, is USAID, right? So there is initially a freeze on USAID, which is a US agency that, as its name indicates, is dedicated towards development. It is responsible for significant amount of of programs. So in the context of Ethiopia, for instance, in fiscal year 2023, about $1 billion worth of aid was provided in the concrete sense of humanitarian, usually aid, for food security, for healthcare, right? So this was actually a very, very important element of support for the Ethiopian government, but it's also across Africa. So, for instance, for malaria, for HIV/AIDS issues, right? These are very important, but it misses, by the way, why USAID was established to begin with. It's two sides of a coin, right? There's heads and there's tails. One side of the coin is the support of humanitarian and developmental efforts. And many USAID workers are talented, they are concerned, and their mission is to actually help end some of these things in terms of poverty, food insecurity, etc. So there's one element. The other element is that essentially is a tool of US foreign policy. It's a very, very important tool that's been used to intervene in different countries. And we know this because, as an example, when there was a 90-day freeze that was put on USAID funding, we found that, for instance, 97% of all media in Ukraine is funded by USAID. And all the media in Ukraine have one voice that they've been singing: continuation of slaughter and war. There's no even anti-war and pro-peace element in that. It's very much in line with US interest in terms of beating the war drums until the last Ukrainian is dead in order to defeat and weaken Russia. This is just to give you one illustration, right?
Very
So the USAID question actually is very, very important, because why is it then that the Trump administration wants to get rid of a very important institution of US foreign policy and power projection? Because it's not working. See, right now you have the reorganization process. Like I told you, there's a retraction, and it's about creating a meaner, a leaner, a much more efficient, right, state. And so the soft power associated with USAID type of activities, where it presents itself as not governmental, right? It's part of civil society. That's the way it presented itself. And it was able to effectively then advocate for and push through policies that the US government, right, political policies, et cetera, were in line with through media, through political training, et cetera. So what you have then is a rethink of that, right? And so it creates, obviously, pain and devastation for certain segments in terms of aid. But this is a wake-up call also, because again, many people ask, why should Africa be food insecure, right? And there's quite a bit of discussion we can have of how Africa could actually, because it has the most arable land on the planet. It's quite a bit. Same thing with Ethiopia in terms of its potential. So there's an element with.
We seem to export lots of food from Africa, but yet starve.
Well, there's a reorganization of African economies from the production of food crops to the production of cash crops. And then an insult to injury is the production of cash crops in which the value is not even captured by African farmers. A good example is, for instance, the price you get for beans, coffee beans, as an example, right? So that's the kind of way in which the economies were organized. But USAID also plays a very important role in terms of an outlet. What's the food that's being provided to these countries? It's surplus agricultural products that are produced in the United States that can then be offloaded on these markets, right? So what it does basically is you're destroying your own agricultural base. So
Really dependent on them.
Of course, you'll be food dependent for sure, right? Because if you can't actually have a viable agricultural base where farmers get a significant market price for their products, but if your market is flooded by donated grain, that tanks the poor farmers' margins, and that's what you'll see. So there's many sides to the USAID story, aside from, for instance, a singular focus on its positive attributes. And so we can see the Trump administration's, not just as a Trump administration, but the transformation that's happening in the United States. So respect to Ethiopia, by the way, this creates a lot of pressure, right? You have so many of the population right now that are war affected, displaced, millions, don't have exact figures, millions that are also food insecure. And so it's in this context then that you have the rejigging of USAID, perhaps less provision in terms of help for food security, et cetera. And that's very, very worrying, right? So this puts another squeeze on the Abiy Ahmed administration. Any government that's running Ethiopia today is faced with incredible pressures that are coming at it in different directions. And so this small adjustment to USAID has actually a significant impact on the Ethiopian domestic economy. So, having an outreach and trying to find a solution, let's say, to that economic problem and others is very pragmatic, right? It's actually very pragmatic.
Yes, but perhaps we can ask whether what the government could have done in terms of resolving economic problem. I mean, the government is building factories of, drones and et cetera, for war. It's not building other food factories or not helping farmers or anything else. So the government is not doing enough for the Ethiopian community to be food independent, but rather investing on other ridiculous things like, decorations on the street, lights, and importing trees, like irrelevant trees are not important, just for beauty. And you do that at the same time, and then you go and beg for money. And then, of course, it doesn't really work, does it? At the same time, having said that, after they send that message to Trump, on that same week, they put out a news saying that we have built a good relationship with Russia. Just like you said previously, if the competition is between America and China, Russia is the most important part. Building a relationship with Russia, will it not bring another conflict? I mean, it's a probably clever game, but will we lose or not? What do you think of it?
So, so I'll come to the Russia. I just wanted to mention maybe just very quickly, the developmental strategy that's being followed so far the past 7 years, right? It's very, very early on. And this goes broad-based. So we're talking about even individuals and groups that were for a reform movement in Ethiopia. They had some criticisms regarding the existing political economy in Ethiopia at that time, which was driven by the state. So it was a developmental state that had a particular objective. It had 5-year plans. Their objective was to industrialize, to transform agriculture in a particular way. It was very much reliant on investment, heavy investment. And the state made a decision regarding what kind of investments, where, for what purposes. And these investments resulted in, let's say, increasing the energy production capacity of the country, increasing infrastructure in terms of roads and connectivity, so on and so forth. So what you've had since 2018 was a deconstruction of that state. So not only do you have a deconstruction of that political economy, but you have in its place something very interesting. It started earlier on, by the way, during Haile Mariam Desalegn, the former prime minister, is his tenure, and it was broadly accepted within the four-party coalition. So any coalition members, let's say in the Oromo coalition or the Amara coalition, who today, let's say, find themselves as part of a opposition to the government, if they tell you that they did not agree to this type of political economy, it's already on record. You can see it earlier on in Haile Selassie's administration that the EPRDF in its routine meetings had made a decision to shift their focus from focusing on agriculture and agricultural-led development, which meant that a significant amount of the state's perspective, let's say, and desire was to focus on 80% of the population. So they wanted to shift away from that. They made that decision. And that decision led to, for instance, inviting foreign capital, foreign direct investment to create large-scale agricultural enterprises that were going to be then based upon dispossessing various communities across Ethiopia. It also was based on an industrial model that was taking advantage of the supply chain transformation in China, which was looking for greater, higher value type of products that they were producing. And so they would offload, let's say, textiles and textile productions, right? Yeah. So in many ways, it was a gamble. There was a certain sense to it. But you had a sense of where things were going. So for industrialization, you need energy. And you can see the dam building and energy construction that was happening. So there's a logic to all these things. You also need access to international trade that is reliable and relatively cheap in terms of transportation. Hence, you have the Djibouti to Addis Ababa rail system that was renovated, as an example, and expanded and so on. So what you have, though, today, it's very unfortunate, is a complete rejection of that model and a focus on essentially urban development. And urban-based development, which is less than 20% of the population. And when we say urban-based development, essentially, we're not even talking about most urban areas in the country, but a few urban centers. Primarily, the lion's share goes to Addis Ababa, the capital. And when you then look at the type of projects that are touted, in many ways, they're, real estate investments. There are projects that are of beautification, housing, and so on and so forth. There's, they're legitimately interesting and so on, but they're a sideshow, right? Look at the job generation, wealth creation, etc. They're really a sideshow, and that's why you have to have these. The strategy, of development is has to be a spectacle. When was the last time that you saw some of the prime ministers previous to Abiy Ahmed that really were giving you a guided tour of every single park or lodge that was opened up? I mean, it's unfathomable.
No, you may see it on the news, but you don't see them going there all the time.
Exactly, but there's a logic
on that.
But there's a logic to this. It's not just the behavior and, let's say, the attributes of the prime minister, let's say, to want to be on front stage and etc. So there's those elements in terms of as an individual, but it really has to do with the way in which you have this ideology, and that comes essentially from prosperity gospel. The idea is that as long as you think positive and that you see beautiful things, this is the way in which you have this virtuous circle that you're going to be rewarded. And so wealth and poverty becomes an individual issue, right? So it's a failure at the individual level, and it's a failure of you to actually, envision and desire and essentially manifest, right? Manifest a different type of reality. So it comes from that. It's being fed by that ideology, but because over 80% of the population, right, is basically untouched by this development. It's not encompassing. And so they don't see it. And so the spectacle becomes important as kind of a echo chamber to constantly, no one is asking, for instance, have you opened a university in your entire 7 years? Is there a new rail system that has been upgraded, or old projects that have been, etc.? Right? What is your so there are concrete questions. Development is not an issue.
The other way around. The factories has been closed. Road construction has been stopped. People seem to be jobless because of this. And it just created, and then because you wanted to develop the urban areas, you bring so many people. They became homeless and they lost their little shops and things like that. I don't see any benefit to it.
It's
Beauty, of course.
So from a social perspective, from a society perspective, of course there's no benefit, but there's huge winners in this type of economic rearrangement of the Ethiopian political economy. And it's going to be a very small circle of well-connected businesses and individuals that are going to create incredible wealth streams for themselves at the expense, by the way, of long-term economic health. At the same time, you have an unrelenting militarization and use of force to resolve or address political issues. And what that does is, first, it actually destroys existing capital, right? So $30 billion worth of existing fixed capital. It took 20 years to build it, the infrastructure, the factories, etc., has been destroyed in war in Tigray, mostly between 2020 and 2022. Today in Oromia and Amara, it's not only just a loss of life, which obviously is very important and objectionable, but it's also, again, the loss of economic activity, right, as a result of war. There's also a question of uncertainty. Right. So one of the things that is required for investment, even for a company, local companies, they have to have a level of certainty what's going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. What is the interest rate policy? Are we going to have access to foreign exchange? What does it look like? What about the market? Can we travel from where we produce something to the market? So if you produce something in Waliso, or I don't know where, let's say Debra Burhan, can you actually make it to the large market in Addis Ababa? Or is there no possibility, right? So because of insecurity. So all these things are...
Companies, they burn down. It's not just getting there. The actual factories have been burned down during the war. It could happen to anywhere by now.
Absolutely. And so from both domestic economic actors, but certainly from foreign investors, whether they are government and government entities. So for instance, China has been a very important player in the Ethiopian economy, but also private foreign investors, they're looking at the risk to their investment. And they're looking at the level of certainty that they have in terms of security and so on. So I think from those, when we look at it from that angle, Abiy can leave tomorrow, but you're still left with those objective conditions that have to be addressed. And so I think that we went on for quite some time on that, but that's an important element to understand that aspect. So in that context, the discussion about Russia is interesting because, there's a tendency to think of Ethiopia, and many do, by the way, as some sort of basket case. In some cases, there are people that, will, without any embarrassment, say Ethiopia doesn't exist, right? It only is a figment of, Emperor Menelik maybe, or it's just about 150 years, 200 years old, right? It has different names, etc. That's almost like going to the People's Republic of China today, which is 70 years old, and saying that there is no connection between the People's Republic of China and different states and empires within the territory that we have today, right? Same thing with Iran, etc. So there's an underappreciation of Ethiopia as a culture, as a long civilization, as something that endures despite so many challenges that you've seen in the past 200-300 years, as an example. But there's also an underappreciation of the sort of, let's say, objective facts demographically. It is the second most populous country in Africa. It's within the probably top 10 in the world. If you look at the population increase. Maybe in 10 years or so, we're looking at 150 million Ethiopians, majority of which, by the way, is going to be very young, right? So the energy level, the creativity that comes with youth, if it can be harnessed. You look at the size of Ethiopia and its geostrategic location, landlocked or not, it's very significant. It's the power of the region. It is the water tower of Africa with significant resources. So what's very ironic is on one level, you have the image of Ethiopia that is tied to these narratives. I would say even fallacious narratives, right? These are narratives that are dishonest, right? They're really dishonest narratives, but they have a political agenda. So for instance, the narrative that Ethiopia is a perpetually sort of starving sort of country, right? Or it is frozen in time and space. It's never been frozen in time and space, this place, this state, or this society, right? So, and you see this because in 2008, you had one of the largest land grabs globally, and one of the epicenters for finding fertile land and adequate levels of water was Ethiopia. So you mean to say that this place that's been depicted as a paragon of famine has incredible natural resources for food security, water to generate electricity, and to actually have regional connectivity? So I think when we talk about Russia and Ethiopia relations, we have to look at how do other powers and economic centers look at Ethiopia. And so the way they look at it, for instance, the Russians are, this is a very important country. The Chinese see Ethiopia as a very important country, irrespective, by the way, of the administration and power. Whether you're communist, whether you're religious or not religious, this is a very, very important country in a very strategic area of the world, both in terms of the broader Middle East, which is kind of the center of global energy. That's why it's important, but also Africa itself. So, Russia relations with Ethiopia, very, very productive, actually, right? So I want you to think how important Russia has played in Ethiopian history. Both Ethiopia and Russia were at the forefront of fighting fascism, right? And so if you look at the narrative today in terms of Russia and Ukraine, one of the arguments that they make is that, a lot of the groups that are in Ukraine are neo-Nazis, and they're not even hiding it, right? So there's this kind of, so you can see the affinity between Ethiopia and Russia. Russians know Ethiopia, particularly as Russian Orthodox Christians. They have a particular way of thinking about Ethiopia, which is slightly different than, let's say, African countries, because of that sort of religious connection and religious framework. There's a recognition that Ethiopia is this long historical society that has different state forms, but very long and historical, right? So Ethiopia had became an Orthodox state. Christianity was a religion, as a state religion, by Emperor Izana in the Kingdom of Aksum around 325 AD, one of the earliest states to actually, and we know that because of his the coins that were minted during that period, where he switched from a non-Christian symbol on the coin that would have, a symbol of the moon and a crescent to one that had the cross, right? So it was a really interesting moment in history where we can find coinage as a way of looking at the significance of Ethiopia at that time in terms of Christianity and the broader sort of politics around it globally. And so, Russian relations concretely today, right? This is not communist Russia, and they're very commercially oriented political elite. And so the interactions with Ethiopia started earlier on, 2012, 2014, I believe. But since Abiy Ahmed's administration in 2000, let's say 18, you've have a confluence of interests. So for Ethiopia, Abiy's interest is to develop a naval force, right? And this naval force is operating and functioning and training in Bishoftu, which is, several hours drive inland, right? So it's not in any coast, by the way. So one of the things is the desire to become a maritime power. And this is a real desire, right? And resuscitation of Ethiopia's navy, which it had prior to 1991. And so about 1,000 Ethiopian sailors have gone to Russia to train. And Russia is very important in terms of trying to establish that relationship concretely, right, in terms of training, doctrine, equipment, and so on. The other element, which is very interesting, is that Russia is the premier nuclear power producer of technology and provider, and particularly Rosatom. And so I think it was early in 2018, 2020, there were preliminary agreements to establish nuclear facilities, nuclear power plants in Ethiopia. And I think they also have another one in 2025 where that's coming to fruition. But it's the training of nuclear scientists. It is the, again, production of nuclear power plants. In this context, by the way, nuclear technology has taken an incredible technological leap. And Russia is at the forefront of it. So most plants on average might be lasting 40 to 50 years. Currently, we have nuclear technology in which the power plants can last up to 100 years, about a century. The financing is also coming from the Russian government themselves. The nuclear waste is also going to be taken care of and recycled by the Russian government themselves. So it's an incredible opportunity when we look at for Ethiopia, right, in terms of energy, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of job creation, in terms of nuclear power. The other area where I think it's very interesting, I think there's about 360% increase in terms of the commercial activity between Ethiopia and Russia. In the negotiations with Trump, one of the private sort of business people that were part of the negotiations in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, I think, one of the presentations that he gave to the American delegation was to convince them the economic loss and opportunity that American businesses have suffered because of that negative relationship. It was around $320 billion that American companies, whether it's Visa and MasterCard or General Motors, et cetera, are losing because they lost access to the Russian market. So the Russian market as a market for Ethiopia is there. So Ethiopia should actually normally try to see how they can take advantage of it. The other thing is that Russia itself also is a provider of grains, provider of fertilizers. So it's a very important economic sort of actor. Now, Russia also is willing to invest in mining, in agriculture. So as an investor, okay, so I think that is also something that is very beneficial and interesting. Russia also sees Ethiopia as a key ally in terms of diplomacy. Ethiopia actually
really, because if you remember when the whole world was against Russia, and Ethiopia seemed to be quite, although Ethiopia didn't go against Russia, rather neutral. It's always been neutral. Of course, Eritrea, Isaias was always on Russia's side, probably have strongest relationship. I mean, if Ethiopia and Eritrea would, have a good relationship, then, together with Russia, it could be big things in Africa, don't you think?
So I think different countries are going to make their own decisions, right? And so what you find today is it's about relationships. And so the key issue for any country is how do you develop relationships that are beneficial to you? Commercial relationships, security relationships. And so from the Ethiopian perspective, they need to diversify and to deepen their relationship to some of the key sort of important actors. Now, Russia is one of them. So in terms of diplomacy, for instance, Ethiopia played, I think, a very interesting role. Like you said, they were pretty much non-aligned. They did not, for instance, condemn Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. So, you can see from those that it was a very important sort of position that they were taking. By the way, no different than India. Remember, India has been taken to task many times, and the Indian foreign minister is very eloquent when he describes and says, look, we make decisions based upon our national interest, not based upon yours. So India basically buys at a discount Russian oil and is making a killing as a result of it. So
India is much more stronger economically.
But it tells you any country can actually diversify its relationship and seek its own path towards relationships, right? Even one in which case Ethiopia today finds itself in a very precarious situation politically, right? Maybe 10 years ago was much more stronger, but today internally there's so much division and conflict, et cetera, that makes it very difficult, right, to extend its power in a way. But even in that context, you can see that. So I think it's an important element that's available for Ethiopia, and don't forget that the Russians want access to warm waters, and so the option that they had was in Tartus in Syria. That is very precarious. They've been working to find a uh, a, uh, a base of foothold in the Red Sea. Port Sudan was an option for them prior to the Sudanese essentially civil war that started, and so it's still up in the air. And so there's an element of Russia playing a very important role, an increasingly important role in Africa and across Africa, both in, let's say, the Horn of Africa, as I just stated, but across Africa, very important relationships with countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, with Central African Republic. And so, the Russians are looking to extend their influence, to garner greater levels of diplomatic support, to have access for markets for some of their products. Weapons are some of their products, nuclear power, some of their products, agriculture. For instance, I think in Ethiopia, there is a talk also about the opening up of car plants, Lada, right, to produce EVs, electric vehicles, right? Russia also was very important in pushing and advocating for Ethiopia's admittance into the BRICS Plus, which really caught many people by surprise, by the way, right? South Africa is a key member, but large heavyweights such as Nigeria, didn't make the cut. It was Ethiopia that was favored, and so Ethiopia right now, I think, has an opportunity then to see how in the changing environment that you find yourself in, for instance, the development of cryptocurrency, where no longer is it required, for instance, to go through Western controlled banks in which sanctions can be a problem, but rather through alternative financial systems, right? In which then you can also buy and sell using local currency. So the relationship that's being talked about now is the possibility of having birr to ruble, Ethiopian birr to Russian ruble, as a form of exchange rather than, let's say, for instance, constantly searching for dollars, right? And many countries are trying to devise these mechanisms as well. That will help in terms of Ethiopia's economy and general stability and so on. So I think we should see it in a positive light. And for the Trump administrations, their interest is to see a greater diminution of Russian influence generally, and not just only in Africa, but generally. And certainly they are focused laser-like on the competition with China. And this goes headstrong against the, let's say, advantages for Ethiopia, which is a BRICS-based opportunity that it can take advantage of. And I want you to think here, put away, let's say, the acrimonious politics that we have, right? Because you have Ethiopian businesses and entrepreneurs that are looking for funding, investment, support, access to markets. So when you look at it from that perspective, BRICS is an incredibly lucrative market that's developing, right? BRICS countries, and BRICS as a source for capital and investment is also slowly emerging as well. And I think, from that perspective, we should actually be very, this should be one of the good news that we're discussing today.
Yes. Well, providing we have a decent government, just so you know, there's so many businesses being closed, especially Ethiopian-owned businesses being closed. There's no, foreign currency. The system is corrupted and not supportive, and lots of businessmen have been, banned, and money has been frozen in banks and closed down, and they migrating, taking their money out and taking them to Dubai, and other companies have been moving to Kenya and all the rest of it. So all these things, providing we have a government that actually cares and work on the internal peace and democracy, but yet we haven't got that. So it's just a wish with all these chances that you said. But in terms of the previous government, they've always been gambling between East and the West. So they threaten the West so that by going to the East, and then of course the West come forward, and we say that, and the East is all coming with less pressure, of course. The East, the China comes in and they do all the jobs and stuff, but they don't interfere in politics and the rest of it. Probably they give you comparatively some sort of freedom, but the West interferes in everything. So having said that, now the government wanted to build relationship with Trump administration, and at the same time, the government wanted to build relationship with, China or Russia, and would that put the government into some sort of conflicts because the West, are they going to accept this or not? But at the same time, because of the TPLF, the West seem to be having every right to decide in our government. Just recently, during the Tigray, the war, it was just the Americans and the West have been interfering on behalf of TPLF, and of course they put them in power. But then recently there've been this conflict between two TPLF groups, and the mediator is not the federal government; it's the West again. Or last time, Getachew Reda migrated, escaped to Addis Ababa with the foreign minister, sat with the West, the foreign diplomats discussing Tigray. So can we say, well, I wouldn't say free from the West, but the West is fully in the country, aren't they?